I wanted to show you a couple things real quick before I pray and begin. If you like Sinclair Ferguson's books, who's much loved in the Presbyterian tradition, he has this little short book on church history, just called In the Year of Our Lord, where he takes each century and kind of highlights two things maybe that are of significance in that century and kind of offers a pastoral reflection on the significance of it. So it's a good little history book to read through, and you get a good sense of the flow, And then a little more detailed, but also smaller book on church history is this Essential Companion. Zondervan, the publisher, has published essential companions to all kinds of things, and the one on church history is nice. One, it's a very pretty book, like it has great photos throughout, of the various places, And kind of, once again, it uses the century framework, just telling you significant things happening in each century. So each chapter is the next century. All right, let's pray together and we'll dive in. Gracious God, on this Palm Sunday morning, we give you thanks. We add our Hosanna to those 2,000 years ago. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We praise you as our King and Savior. And we ask that during this time as we study church history would be inspired and grow in wisdom. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so today we're focusing on the 16 and 1700s. Various things happening in those two centuries, and it's going to finally get us up into the American portion of church history just right here at the tail end, because that's basically where we are in that history. It's important to know that at any one moment in history, there are tons of things happening. That's why the study of history is hard to be comprehensive, and why people will specialize, in just a particular time frame or particular place. And all those things that are happening, it's always a mixed bag, right? In some places, positive things are happening that are moving things forward. In other places, negative things are happening that might be breaking down society. So even just focusing on the history of the church, we're ignoring general world history happening at this time. But there's tons of stuff happening in the church, too, at this point, that it's hard to grasp it. So we're just going to focus on some of these larger movements, namely Puritanism, Pietism, and revivals. All right, things that are emerging, beginning in Europe, and then eventually moving over to the American colonies. So one of the things that starts to happen in the 1600s is sometimes called the Wars of Religion, by which is meant not just religious-based wars, but wars within Christianity. So different Christian groups who are at war with each other. One of the more famous ones is the 30 Years' War, which at one point almost every country in Western Europe is involved in it. And it concludes with the Peace of Westphalia. This is important in the history of the church because it determines this peace is for the first time these countries decide, okay, it's going to be all right if we have different kinds of churches in our country. So you have to remember that for centuries, Europe has had basically a unified society, around the Roman Catholic Church. When you start having reform and church split movements happening, it feels like it's breaking down society, right? All of society. So there's kind of this fear of this vulnerability. Our whole society is going to fall apart if we don't have a unified society. And so it's only through the process of these wars that people kind of get worn out fighting about these things and decide maybe, okay, no one side is going to win. We're going to have to let it be okay for there to be both a Roman Catholic church in this town and a Lutheran church, or a Roman Catholic church and a Reformed church, something like that. So the Peace of Westphalia guarantees religious tolerance for Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed churches underneath the same sovereign, underneath the same king or magistrate.
Was that as a result of the 30 Years' War?
Yeah, as a result of the Peace of Westphalia. And that sort of idea is significant because now we take for granted a religiously pluralistic society, right? But this is basically kind of unknown, unfamiliar at that point, and had been for centuries. So that's going to impact the way that the eventual United States, of course, would be, and even the way that the various European democracies, function today. Now, it would not last. It would not continue on perfectly. For instance, in France, in 1685, which is a little bit, after this, King Louis XIV just outlaws Protestantism again. So he said, all right, never mind. We had that peace, but we don't like these Protestants, and so French Protestants would be persecuted again. And once again, we refer to French Protestants. How do you remember the Huguenots or Huguenot, is how some people say it, would continue to experience religious persecution and flee to North America as well as South Africa and other parts of Europe. Okay, but but you get the sense that something new is happening, though, in Europe. Religious plurality. But by religious plurality, we mean different kinds of Christian at this point. All right. So you're going to still have conflicts, intramural conflicts, moving forward even after the Peace of Westphalia in places like England with the Puritan Revolution. Puritans were this group of people who they get their name from their desire to continue purifying the church of all remnants of Roman Catholicism. They want to keep on getting rid of anything that looks, smells, or sounds like the Pope or the Roman Church. And it's not yet like an organized church. It's more of a movement within the English church. But will eventually kind of rise up and lead to the Republican era in English history. By that I mean there was a short time period in which the king is deposed and you have a republic being a form of government in England. And it's during that time that the Parliament is basically in control, and they have as their head Oliver Cromwell. You know this history? Remember this? He took the title Lord Protector rather than king. And he has the Parliament on his side, and they depose Charles I. This is in 1649. And for this brief sort of period of about 11 years or so, the period is referred to as the interregnum. Any kind of English, British history buffs in here? Well, we got at least an American history buff, Now, part of what's driving this is these Puritans involved in Parliament who think that the Church of England needs to be continually purified of the remnants of popishness. Because remember, earlier, Queen Elizabeth had this settlement, this sort of middle way that still accommodated the medieval forms of church. Well, the Puritans don't like that. They don't want that. And it extended to government. Now, some people have seen this as sort of a Presbyterian invasion of the English, because the Presbyterians have that Republican form of church governance where elders are elected from the community and given authority, kind of from the ground up. Whereas the English system has bishops, which is still like a monarchical system, right? So the Presbyterians kind of get their way for a little while. One of the big things that comes out of this theologically is the Westminster Assembly. You can see it begins 1643, just before the interregnum, and it lasts into it. And the Westminster Assembly is this gathering of all the top theologians, as well as members of Parliament, Puritan members of Parliament. They get together over this course of 10 years, and they produce what we today know as the Westminster Confession, the larger and shorter catechism, and they also produce a book of public worship to govern the churches. So they're pushing all the churches in England in this Presbyterian direction, away from its historically Anglican one. Does this make sense? All right. Well, the Westminster Assembly will be significant because their theological conclusions, the fruit of their work, it still shapes all Presbyterian churches today and many other Reformed. It shaped all the original Congregationalist and Baptist churches, which were also Reformed in their theology. That is, these groups took their theological standards were the Westminster standards. Let me say another word about this. So Presbyterians are typically thought of as the Scottish. All right. Congregationalist Puritans were English. So these are people they want to split off from the Church of England and kind of start their own pure thing. That's the Congregationalist movement begins in the 1600s. They will export that to the American colonies, of course. And then the Baptists are also Puritans originally, who are Reformed in theology, Their main distinctive is that they kind of reject the covenant theology you find in the Congregationalist churches, and therefore do not baptize infants. Only baptize people after they have professed faith. And that was their distinctive.
Did you say they were Puritans?
Yeah, Puritans. Yeah. All those come out of Puritans are in all three of these church movements. Yes.
Under that distinction, are the Pilgrims and the Separatists still part of the Puritan movement, or are they?
They are.
Okay.
Yeah, they are, but they're separatist Puritans, right? Doing their own thing. You have like the non-separatist Massachusetts Bay folks, right? And as you know. So since there's not like one key leader here, you end up often having little factions, even within groups, and only later kind of coming back together or being recognized as a visible group, All kinds of reform-minded people in the churches doing stuff. All right, so this doesn't only last until 1660, when the monarchy types come back and restore Charles I's heir, Charles I who had been beheaded. All right, so it's always interesting when people try to establish a kind of Christian community through non-Christian means, But Charles II is restored in 1660. He just reigns for 5 more years. And then his son, James II, becomes king in 1685. This is not going to last very long. James II gets to reign for about 3 years before the Glorious Revolution. One of the problems with James II, he's James II of England and like James VI or something of Scotland, is that he's Catholic. It's like, all right, after all the Puritan effort and reform effort to make the Church of England thoroughly Protestant and then thoroughly not Catholic, now they have a Catholic monarch back in, which will lead to the Glorious Revolution, right, as it's called. The Glorious Revolution is when James II is deposed. William and Mary of Orange become the next king and queen. Do you know the story of the Glorious Revolution? So Mary is actually Charles II's daughter, and she's married to a Dutch man named William. So William is Dutch. And at this point in time, many of the European kingdoms are all like intermarried and related. It's hard to make sense. You think there'd be more peace, but it's not the case. And that, of course, restores the church back to its Protestant identity once you have a Dutch and English individuals on the throne again. All right. What else do I want to highlight here? I think it's important just to see, for the sake of the church, there's the continuing effort sparked in the Reformation to purify the church. And then you have different attitudes about how far that needs to go. Does that need to extend to every aspect of church life? The way we do clergy, the way we do church leadership, the way we do worship, or only to some aspects of church life in disagreements? I think it's important to see the 1600s as the emergence of these recognizable groups that we still know of, Baptist and Congregational churches. One of the ideas of the Congregationalist church is it's non-hierarchical. It's their ministers are chosen by the congregation themselves, which once again is something that non-denominational and Baptist churches take for granted. They all do that, even though it was a new thing at the time. Questions about that? Yes.
So I'm dying to find out when the Baptists stopped being reformed, but you may be getting there.
No, I'm not planning to go do a Baptist history course. So, when the Baptist churches emerge, they develop 2 streams pretty quickly. And there's something called the Particular Baptists, which were reformed. They're basically keeping Westminster standards as their standards. They write the London Baptist Confession, which is just a revision of the Westminster Confession. And then you have the General Baptist, which is a more popular lay level, or popular level, I should say, movement, which moved in the more theologically Arminian direction. You see their heirs in like the Free Will Baptist movement. Like you occasionally see a church called a Free Will Baptist. So one tends to be more connected to the historic theological tradition, the Particular Baptist, one less so. Even both those groups will come over to North America and establish different kinds of traditions. So today there still are very Reformed Baptist communities. Southern Seminary is known as like kind of the headquarters of Reformed Baptist life. Other ones like Mid-America, Mid-Atlantic, one of those. And then there are other Baptists who are less so. They're more in the Arminian stream, not emphasizing Calvinist doctrine, and sometimes anti-Calvinist doctrine. Baptist life is a mix of things. Think about the difference between like a country Free Will Baptist church and like First Baptist Church of Charleston, South Carolina or something, where they're still going to wear robes. The ministers will wear robes, and everything's still very formal, liturgical. There's a big difference between First Baptist here and like, Kingston, the little Baptist church out in Kingston or something. So it's hard to generalize about Baptist churches because they can be so different from one another. That's the thing about them. One thing about them is they have no central authority. Baptists, one of their distinctives is to be local church autonomy. And that is to say, each church is responsible for itself. They choose to associate with other groups like the Southern Baptist Convention or the American Baptist, but that convention actually has no authority over the local church. The local church still determines all its own rules. That's what I mean by local church autonomy. So anybody can get together and start a new church and call it whatever Baptist church. Fifth and Broad Baptist Church. So that's what would be right here, right? Or right here, I should say. But you can't do that with the other denominations because they have structural authorities that go beyond the local church. Does that make sense? Some early Baptists that you're familiar with, the most famous is probably John Bunyan, writer of the Pilgrim's Progress. So he's in the 1600s. He's part of that movement. That's this group of churches that are trying to leave the Church of England, and they experience persecution as a result. That's why Bunyan is eventually put in prison. But you also see he's Puritan totally in his theology. If you read the Pilgrim's Progress, it's just an exposition of applied Puritan theology. One of the things about the Puritans is that they were very serious about their faith. And it's not a situation where you have just the clergy who are serious. It's like people are Puritan by choice. Yeah, so, usually when somebody is something by choice, they're very serious about it. It's kind of like when you meet someone who was born and raised Catholic versus someone who converts to Catholicism. Someone who converts to it is really taking all that stuff seriously. And so Puritans are kind of like that, especially this first couple generations of it. As a result of that meant it made its way, that seriousness made its way all the way down to the family and children and such. And so we still have examples of Puritan family devotionals. And they're rich, they're serious, they're theologically dense. You can read the journals of just your average Puritan believer, and they're very mature spiritually, thinking deeply about their life. There's a real God-centeredness. There's no sense that just, because I'm English, I'm Christian, or because I'm German, I'm Christian, or whatever. The Puritans are definitely taking their devotional life seriously. So in that sense, Puritans sometimes have a negative connotation. Some people think something negative of them. My course with J.I. Packer on the Puritans really turned that upside down. It's like they're taking their devotion to the Lord very seriously and wanted it to impact every aspect of their life. And eventually they want to build societies, whole, truly devoted societies. So some of the first settlements in North America are Puritan settlements aimed at being holistically Christian in every aspect, So not just in name and institution, but in practice. Packer actually says the Puritans are one of the most mature generation of Christians that have ever existed, he thinks. Now, some people think Puritans mean they're like killjoys or something, but that really wasn't the case. They could still have fun. Or that they were responsible for burning witches and stuff, which actually hardly ever never really happened. It only happened in certain scenarios. It's not really a common thing. But most of these movements, once you get second and third generation people in the movement, they don't take it as seriously anymore, right? and it starts to lose its energy, its power. By the time grandchildren are no longer reacting to the bad thing that caused the Puritans to exist in the first place, it's not that important. It doesn't feel that important. And you see that in other aspects of life, right?
So did they meld into different congregations? Did they go, what did they generally affiliate with?
Well, even today, many Presbyterians and Baptists would see themselves as heirs of the Puritans. It's only in a Reformed seminary where, as I had this course at Reformed Theological Seminary with J.I. Packer. That's the only place you're going to have classes on the Puritans. Your very sort of liberal, progressive schools are not going to have classes on the Puritans. They don't like them. The very first Baptist churches they're all English speaking. But it actually starts in Holland. There's this guy named John Smythe and another guy named Helwys. They flee England to Holland, and they start the very first Baptist church there. They rebaptize themselves and create a new community. And in some ways, it's continuing the Puritan impulse that the church ought to be a pure body with no unbelievers in it. So everyone ought to be converted. That's part of their ideology. And the only way you can know is you have to be baptized. So even today, typically, if you come into a Baptist church, you have to be baptized before becoming a member. Even if you've been baptized in another church, you just have to be rebaptized and become part of this. That is, if you were baptized as an infant. It's not considered valid. All right, so now we're getting more groups on the scene, right? We got Anglicans, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, and Baptists. Well, guess what? There's more. The Methodists. We got to talk about them, right? Where do they come from? But that moves us into the 1700s. But let's keep going with the later 1600s and the Pietist movement. This says Lutheran. Two of the major figures in Lutheran Pietism are Philip Jacob Spener and August Franke. Franke is associated with the University of Halle. He is, I think, either founds it or is one of the first presidents. Pietism is this movement that emerges out of Protestantism in its kind of third and fourth generation. And one of the reasons it emerges is because, remember that the Protestant Reformation is largely an intellectual movement, right? It's largely theologians arguing theology against the established church. And the next generation, like after Luther and Calvin, you have this generation of theologians within Reformed Protestantism who are sometimes called the Reformed Scholastics. And the Reformed Scholastics are they're doing stuff like Thomas Aquinas did back in the 12th century, or the 1200s, where they're kind of wanting to get all of doctrine right. They're creating this 1,000-piece puzzle, if you will, called theology or doctrine, in which all the pieces are just right. Even if sometimes they kind of argue like, if you imagine that a perfect system of doctrine is a 1,000-piece puzzle, and imagine that the Bible only gives you 500 of those pieces, well, you can't be content with that. You got to make up the other pieces that are going to fit until you get this perfect system of doctrine. And the different Reformed churches don't all agree on what that exactly should look like. But to the regular Christian who had now been growing up in the Protestant era, they care less about getting our confession of faith right. They're not writing the Augsburg Confession. Their grandparents did. They're not writing Westminster. Their parents did. So it's like what starts to matter is this sense of an experiential practice of Christianity. Like, what about just experiencing God? What about experiencing the power of the Spirit in your life? What about being obedient to the commands of Christ? And so the Pietism doesn't reject the Protestant confessions. It's just sort of, in some ways, it's like this pendulum swinging. The pendulum has to swing to focus on theology and doctrine during the Reformation. And now people are like, okay, we got that settled, but now we want our religion to be real, to be alive, to be full, life-giving. So Pietism is really about that, about re-engaging a sense of experiencing God and practically obeying God in your daily life. Spener wrote a book called Pious Wishes, or Pia Desideria, where he's starting to say, it's not enough to have our church structures and theology right, I need to get my heart right. And so my heart has desires that are impious or wrong. What do I do to grow as a Christian? So sanctification, not just as a doctrine, but as a practice, is what Pietists care about, right? So once again, you shouldn't see Pietism as like a protest against Protestantism, but more as like it's going to its next step, re-engaging the heart, if you will. That's going to be important because it's going to shape all of Christianity after that. Everything up to the Pentecostal movement in the 20th century. The desire for a religion of the heart. Okay, so the English version of Pietism is the Methodist. Just for the sake of the notes, I also include some stuff about Count Zinzendorf and the Moravians. This was Pietism happening in the modern Czech Republic. It was like Bohemia and Moravia at the time. And this guy, he's a German count, he actually becomes the sponsor for this group of Christians called the Moravians. The Moravians are one of the first missionary sending groups of people. They come out of this Pietist movement in Germany and in modern-day Czech Republic. But let's talk about the Methodists. Okay, now we're into the 1700s. Got it? John Wesley's born in 1703. He becomes an Anglican minister. He goes to Oxford. Him and his brother they go to Oxford. They also start seeing that Protestantism itself in England has become kind of dry and crusty. So what can we do to re-engage the religion of the heart? So they start a club at Oxford called the Holy Club as a way of getting together and then participating in a kind of life structured by various disciplines together. And that disciplined life of Bible reading and prayer, devotion, acts of service will become characteristic of this group, which is where the term Methodist comes from. They're kind of known for their methods. So it's basically just someone who's taking spiritual discipline seriously at the level of the individual. The whole emergence of small groups, meeting in small groups for prayer and Bible study, that's coming out of Pietism and the Methodist movement. So within the Church of England, eventually Methodists were those people who the ones who were considered they're zealous Christians. They take their faith really seriously. They're the ones out feeding the poor and taking care of the homeless, where everyone is technically Christian, within the Church of England. But the Methodist seems to be the ones actually doing stuff, and taking it seriously. One of the ways in which John Wesley himself takes it seriously is he starts offering services and communion to people in the countryside who can't make it to a church on Sunday. Not only that, it's the beginning of the industrial age. He starts going to coal mines and other various emerging factories to preach the gospel there and to offer communion. So he's doing this thing it's controversial because the cathedral gathering place and the parish church had such importance to social life. He seems to be doing something that deconstructs that social life now by going out to the masses. Wesley becomes famous for his miles and thousands of miles on horseback traveling from one place to another. And eventually people who join his movement do the same thing. They're called circuit riders. Even to this day, the Methodist system has that circuit riding, where the ministers move every few years from one church to another. Anybody grow up in the Methodist tradition? Okay, we have a few. So John Wesley's famous as basically he's taking Anglicanism to the masses. And Methodism, even to this day, is sort of understood as a kind of streamlined Anglicanism. Instead of 39 articles, it's just 27. They have 27 articles. It's a little easier to follow. It's accessible for everyone. A genuine pious devotion. In fact, Wesley's name becomes synonymous with this idea of Christian perfection. And by Christian perfection, Wesley didn't mean that you could achieve a totally sinless life in this world, but he meant that you could grow in your relationship with God to a place where your heart was sort of perfected in love. You might still make mistakes in life, but the heart could be so full of God's love that you were always acting in love. Of course, that's been controversial and is still controversial to this day. Like, how far does sanctification happen in this life? Well, he had a positive view of how far it could go and thought all people ought to be pursuing that, and seeking it. His brother Charles is famous for what? Do you know? Hymns. That's right. I mean, almost any given hymn from your childhood growing up in church, you could look to see who wrote it. It's either Charles Wesley or Isaac Watts, probably. If they wrote it in the 1700s, it was probably one of them. Even some very famous ones we sing in the Presbyterian Church, like "And Can It Be," is a Charles Wesley hymn, which has lines that sound like Reformed theology in it, but good stuff. And he's wrote thousands of them. There's more to Wesley's life. He's an interesting character. Of course, he has a couple of times where he comes over to the American colonies. Famously, when in his younger days, he came over to serve as a kind of missionary to Georgia and spent some time in Savannah. I think there's a memorial to John Wesley in Savannah, right? But evidently there was a spurned love interest, like kind of a wealthier girl who was interested in him. He was not interested, and so the dad's like coming after him, and he has to flee. Right? As he's fleeing back on a ship back to England, the ship is caught in a storm. This is part of his famous conversion story, and he's scared to death. They're about to die. On this ship, he sees a group of Moravians also on the ship who are just singing hymns, like peaceful as can be. They're just serene in the midst of the storm, and he's like, whatever kind of faith they have, it's not like the faith I have. He was like, I'm scared. So he gets back to England, and he's kind of having this soul-searching existential crisis. Walking around the streets one day, he comes to this church meeting. It's like walking out in the cold rain, and there's a church having a meeting on Aldersgate Street. You've heard the story. And he goes in and takes his seat, and the minister is reading from Martin Luther's commentary. It's either the Romans or Galatians commentary. I want to say it's the Romans commentary. Just reading from the commentary. And as he hears it, he says he feels his heart strangely warmed. So that's the famous saying from Wesley, right? My heart was strangely warmed. And I believe that I came to see that I did believe and love the Lord. So he has his sense of assurance is solidified in that moment. And then he'll begin his public ministry later. Some of Wesley's followers come over to the colonies. Probably the most famous is Asbury, a guy last name Asbury. And he kind of takes the Methodist movement, organizes it in the colonies, and causes it to start to spread. So you have circuit riders in the American colonies. Methodism will grow vast, like exponentially on the frontier in the 1800s. It was perfectly suited for that, because you could have a local church without a minister, because the circuit rider, he'll be there on the first Sunday of the month, and he'll be in this church on the second Sunday of the month. And on a given Sunday, a circuit rider may go to 3 or 4 towns and do 3 or 4 services. And so Methodism becomes a separate denomination after Wesley's death. He remains Anglican minister his whole life. Okay, that was a quick summary. But you get a sense that Methodism is taking the impulses of pietism within the Anglican structures and bringing truly devoted faith to the masses. That makes sense? All right, that's just for fun. We should also note, in line with this pietistic movement, also the Quakers emerge out of it in England at the time. George Fox. This is late 1600s, early 1700s. They're like taking the congregational impulse like to the next level, add in a dose of Pentecostalism. What I mean by that is why they get their name. Is that Quakers is a nickname, They're actually called the Society of Friends, right? One distinctives about Quakers is they get together, they have no clergy, no recognized leaders. They get together, they sit in silence until someone feels prompted by the Spirit to speak. And then different people can just stand up and speak from the Spirit. But at times their meetings became kind of intense, spiritually intense, which they interpreted as an outpouring of the Holy Spirit, causing people to literally shake or quake. So they got that nickname of Quakers. There was a smaller group later called the Shakers, but call that to this day, But again, all of them are emerging out of the Pietist impulse. It's just going in different directions. Well, now we got another group. All right. Which brings us finally, with 5 minutes left in this class, to stuff going on in the American colonies. All right. The Age of Revival, which will begin in the 1730s and 40s. The First Great Awakening takes place during that time. These are revivals that are happening in both Europe and in North America. So the Great Awakening is really a transatlantic movement. So you have people like the Wesleys in Great Britain and Europe, and then people like Whitefield and Edwards in North America. The same kind of stuff is happening. These large gatherings, what you think of as a revival starts to happen during this time. A preacher, a music, outdoor open spot like a camp meeting, powerful things seeming to happen, people's lives being changed, and they spread the message abroad. So this is kind of interesting. The First Great Awakening was like the first thing that really unites the 13 colonies and gives them a sense of common identity. Notice this is all happening before the Revolution. I mean, they have, political complaints and stuff already, with the king. But this positive uniting movement. The first celebrity in America is George Whitefield. That is someone who was known in all 13 colonies. So he starts traveling to all 13 colonies. He's a preacher. He had been an actor for a season of his life. And so has this booming voice. He was part of the Holy Club along with the Wesleys at Oxford. He sponsored an orphanage or worked with an orphanage in Georgia. So Whitefield is usually regarded as the great preacher of the First Great Awakening, whereas Jonathan Edwards is the theologian of the Awakening. Edwards is the educated, highly educated dude. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. All right, can I conclude today by talking about Edwards? When we do this, I recognize we're leaving out so much stuff, but it's at least enough highlights to you have a general sense of what's happening in the 16 and 1700s. But this is big, and it'll have big implications for the direction of the emerging nation and stuff. So we got these colonies that have become English colonies, by some bizarre chance, when vast parts of North America had been controlled by the French and the Spanish. That it's English colonies that will succeed is, in some ways, just a miracle of history or whatever. Edwards grows up around the Connecticut, Massachusetts area. His father is a pastor. He sees himself, his whole life, he's a colonialist. He's a loyal British subject, just growing up in the colonies. He's intelligent from a young age. He goes to Yale, which is a new school, out there at the time. And at age 13, he graduates at age 17 at valedictorian and gives his valedictory address in Latin on the Doctrine of Justification. I've held it in my hands. It's in the Bodleian, not the Bodleian, that's the Oxford Library. Anyway, the university has all of Edwards' manuscripts there. And as part of my PhD research, I had to go there and present at a conference, and I got to see all his stuff, which is under armed guard down in the in the basement. And they bring it out to you. You're not supposed to touch it with your hands. You can't take pictures and things like that. He goes on to get a master's degree there, which was not common. Anyway, it's not common for people to get college degrees, but much less a master's degree. And then becomes senior tutor, he's in some ways he's like a full professor at that time, teaching the subjects to other students. It was during a time where you could still pretty much read all the major books that had been written. You could kind of know everything. You could kind of have a comprehensive knowledge of stuff. He's probably the most highly educated person in New England at the time. But he has a desire to be a pastor. So he has a short stint in New York as a pastor, and eventually is hired by his famous grandfather, Solomon Stoddard. Solomon Stoddard is like a megachurch pastor in the colonial times. What would be equivalent to a megachurch? It's a Congregationalist church, so they have this covenantal notion of membership. He's his associate for a few years until his grandfather dies, and he becomes the senior minister in Northampton, Massachusetts. Anybody been there? By chance? Yeah. You can see the first churches are still there where Edwards was minister. He's there for 20-something years. But during the 1730s, he begins to experience revivals in his church. You should know, Edwards is not like emotive, energetic. Like when you think of a fire and brimstone preacher, it is not Jonathan Edwards. All right, he's not that person. He's basically up there reading theologically dense sermons in the 1730s about the doctrine of justification, and then all of a sudden, things start happening. People start having highly kind of emotive experiences in the congregation. And, people are passing out. They're getting excited. Sometimes he's having to calm them down while he continues to read, his manuscript. If all you know of Jonathan Edwards is the sermon "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," which is in like the Norton anthology, you should start over. Forget you ever read that and start over with him, because that may have given you a certain impression that's not true. There's a Yale Jonathan Edwards Center at Yale. There's also a Jonathan Edwards College there, and they have all of his works digitized online, so anybody can read them for free. All right, online. If you're interested in him, you should read something called the Personal Narrative. His personal narrative is like his spiritual autobiography, and you'll see there someone who's just very intoxicated with God, as some people have called him. He uses words like sweetness and like the aroma of God's presence, the gentleness and love. Those are the words he uses far more than wrath language. All right. He's the kind of theologian who would go out in the woods and cry for an hour, looking at the birds and the trees and the flowers, and the sunset. He was this kind of guy. But again, once again, smarter than everybody else around. So as these revivals start happening, he says over the period of about a year, there's 300 conversions in his town. Edwards wants to make sense of this, so he starts interviewing all these people. He sits down with them and asks, "Tell me about your experience. Tell me what's happened. What were you like beforehand? What are you like now?" And he's chronicling all of it. So he becomes a chronicler of the revivals and the one who's sort of theologically making sense of them. And it actually puts him out of sync with the clergy, with the elite clergy of New England. The elite clergy, sometimes called Old Lights, were against these revivals happening. They thought it was all hogwash, like spiritual emotionalism or something. And Edwards becomes one of their defenders. He's defending the revivals as a genuine work of the Spirit. He says, yeah, there's a lot of crazy stuff that happens that's not real, that's just emotions. But there's also a lot of real stuff that's happening. And he developed these marks, like distinguishing marks for determining whether or not a movement was truly from God. And so he publishes that as distinguishing marks of a work of revival, and then 5 other sentences to the title, because that's how Puritans did their thing. He is usually characteristic of American Puritanism at the time, Edwards is. So I wrote my whole master's thesis on Jonathan Edwards, and he's a chapter in my dissertation about him. So he's one of those figures I've spent more time with than others and really appreciate. So that revival's happening in his church in the 30s. By the mid-40s, it's happening in all 13 colonies. So in some ways, he's one of the first places where it starts. One day, Whitefield, who's much younger than Edwards, comes to his church and preaches. The account is that Edwards weeps through the whole thing. Another account of it is that Whitefield meets Edwards' wife, Sarah Edwards, and he thinks she's like the coolest, godliest woman he's ever met. And he's like, all right, I got to get married. I got to find me a woman like that. And the Edwardses have, I think, 10 kids. One of them, their daughters, marries a guy named Aaron Burr. All right. Aaron Burr, who was the president of Princeton College. It was called College of New Jersey at the time. And they have a son named Aaron Burr, Jr., who goes on to become the vice president. That's probably what you know about him, right? Or that he shot Alexander Hamilton. Maybe that's what you know about him. Edwards is actually referred to in the Hamilton musical, but he's referred to as a fire and brimstone preacher, which wasn't quite right. But So let me tell you about how Edwards' life ends. He's eventually kicked out of his church in Northampton. He offends the wrong people, and he tended to offend the rich in his church a good bit. And so they exile him. Well, before they exile him, they fire him and then say, but would you stick around for one more year and keep preaching while we find someone to take your place? Which he needs the money, so he does. He's got 10 kids, so he does. And then he goes to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, and becomes a missionary minister among the Native American people for a series of years, a short period of time, but it's like 5 or 6 years. He writes some of his great philosophical texts, which are still read today. And then finally, he is asked by the College of New Jersey, a.k.a. Princeton, to come be their president. He responds with a list of reasons why he's the wrong man for the job. He doesn't want it. They still want him. They talk him into it. So he goes to New Jersey. He becomes Princeton's president. He's only there for a short time, and he gets a smallpox vaccine. And this was like new medical technology at the time. And he was very interested in science. He loved science. He's like, science is like manifesting the glory of God all over the place. And so he takes this smallpox inoculation and he dies from it. So he's buried in the cemetery at Princeton, still today.
How old was he when he died?
He's only 54. Yeah. Also, I didn't tell you, he was born the same year as Wesley. John Wesley and Jonathan were both born in 1703. They do know of each other because Wesley writes, I think he wrote a letter to Sarah Edwards after Jonathan Edwards died. But some people have thought that modern evangelicalism, its tenor, its character is largely shaped by those two people, Edwards and Wesley. It's people who take theology seriously, who take studying doctrine seriously, but also religion of the heart seriously, a personal relationship with God. That seems like a good place to stop. All right, thanks. Go in peace.